If there's one thing that brings everybody together, it's their dislike of the Academy Awards or the Oscars. Everyone has a movie that they want nominated, and that movie not being nominated is, for some people, tantamount to a crime. Similarly though, there are some people that really want an Oscar, and they would do anything to get it. In this video, I want to take a look at some of those people, as well as other controversies that the Academy Awards have stirred up in their nearly 100-year-long history. One thing to note is that these range the gamut. The first one is basically out-and-out corruption and bribery of the worst kind, but others might seem like they're nothing. But keep in mind that people used to be a lot more sensitive to, for lack of a better word, dishonorable tactics. That alone was enough to be controversial at a certain point in time. Mary Pickford was one of the founding members of the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences, which is the organization that puts on the Academy Awards, and she was married to Douglas Fairbanks, the first president of the Academy. She was also one of the most popular actresses at the time and had a career that spanned half a century. And for just the second ever Academy Award, Pickford decided to award herself the Academy Award for Best Actress. It was for a 1929 movie called Coquette, the first talkie that Pickford, known for her silent films, had starred in. The movie got a lot of press pre-release. After all, she was America's sweetheart and she was taking a leap career-wise. Then the movie came out and the reviews were, for lack of a better word, polite. Keep in mind that there wasn't really a film criticism industry at this point, at least not as we know it. And Pickford was very influential. One bad word from her and you could find yourself blackballed. Later reviewers would have more negative opinions on the movie, with the one critic writing, quote, "This film's historical significance is more interesting than the film itself, which I found to be quite dull and lifeless," end quote. At this time, the award winners were chosen by a 5-member board of judges, as opposed to votes by one's peers in the Academy as they are now. Remember, this was just the second ever Academy Awards. No one knew what film as a medium or the Academy would go on to be like. The only thing we can be sure of is that everyone loves awards. It's like Napoleon said, quote, "You call these baubles. Well, it is with baubles that men are led," end quote. In order to secure her bauble, Pickford invited the board of judges to tea at Pickfair. That was the estate that she shared with Douglas Fairbanks, with whom she had co-founded United Artists along with D.W. Griffith and Charlie Chaplin. An invite to Pickfair was the ultimate status symbol in Hollywood, though at the time it was Hollywood land. It was also a chance to get closer to American entertainment's most powerful couple at the time. Other nominees included Ruth Chatterton in Madam X, Betty Compson in The Barker, Jean Eagles in The Letter, Corinne Griffith in The Divine Lady, and Bessie Love in The Broadway Melody. Apparently, they weren't even notified that they were nominated. According to Bessie Love, quote, "So many people have said it that it must be true," end quote. The bribery led to protests, and the following year, the Academy Awards would move to a voting system. Chill Wills, whose full name was Theodore Childress Wills, was a prolific actor, appearing in dozens of movies over a 40-year-long career. Over those years, he received one Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor. That was for the 1960 historical war epic The Alamo, directed by John Wayne, which proved that Wayne was better in front of the camera than behind it. Wills, who was nearly 60 by this point, really wanted the award and hired a publicist, W.S. Wojciechowicz, also known as Bow Wow, to help him secure it. Bow Wow decided to throw all measure of sense and propriety out the window and go with the hard sell that Harvey Weinstein would later perfect. He treated it as less of an award campaign and more of a political campaign. For example, it's widely accepted that people trade favors. Bow Wow ran an ad in the trades that named people that Wills had voted for in previous Oscar races as a member of the Academy. The implication was simple: I scratched your back, now it's time for you to scratch mine. After that, he ran an ad that named every member of the Academy alphabetically, with a note from Wills that read, quote, "Win, lose, or draw, you're all my cousins and I love you all," end quote. If you want to make the most impersonal pitch in the history of the world, this was it. Groucho Marx then ran his own amusing counter ad that read, quote, "Dear Mr. Chill Wills, I'm delighted to be your cousin, but I voted for Salmoneo," end quote. The same day that Marx ran his ad, Bow Wow had another ad that, I think, was beyond the pale and ran roughshod over any modicum of decency. It invoked the people that died at the Alamo and read, quote, "We of the Alamo cast are praying harder than the real Texans prayed for their lives in the Alamo for Chill Wills to win the Oscar as Best Supporting Actor. Cousin Chill's acting was great. Your Alamo cousins," end quote. Variety refused to run that ad, though it would run John Wayne's rebuke to Wills, quote, "No one in the Batjack or in the Russell Birdwell office had been a party to his trade paper advertising. I refrain from using stronger language because I am sure his intentions are not as bad as his taste, end quote. Wills supposedly was none the wiser. He was from a different era, and maybe he expected that Bow Wow would run a more or less decent campaign. Sure, maybe he would throw a few sharp elbows, but nothing that would be too indecent. Well, he was wrong. Whether or not he knew, Wills would fire Bow Wow and would later say in an interview, quote, "One day I'll get even with that so-and-so if it's the last thing I do," end quote. Whether or not he ever did is unknown, but one thing is certain. After this fiasco, studios decided to play more of a role in the campaign than they did prior to ensure that specific individuals would not go on a lark. As a short counterpoint to Joe Will's failed campaign, Melissa Leo, who played Mark Wahlberg's mother in 2010's The Fighter, launched a successful self-promotion campaign because she didn't trust Paramount to do it right. But instead of hiring a publicist, Leo decided to do all the self-promotion herself. There's something admirable about the hustle. She paid for ads in the trades that showed her wearing faux fur with "Consider" emblazoned across the top. The ads made no mention of the movie that she was in, but everyone knew what it was for. She said that, thanks to her age, 50 at the time, she wasn't getting the magazine covers that she felt she deserved. In her words, quote, "I took matters into my own hands. I knew what I was doing and told my representation how earnest I was about the idea. I had never heard of an actor taking out an ad as themselves and I wanted to give it a shot," end quote. Oscar consultants thought that this was gauche, a step too far, and surely it would hurt her chances. She was, as she said, pimping herself out. Well, they didn't hurt. She would take home the gold at the 83rd Academy Awards. There's something to be said about putting yourself out there. Just remember that you could end up with your reputation ruined like Joe Wills or made like Melissa Leo. There are two traditions that are as inextricable from the Academy Awards as much as complaining about the Academy Awards are from fans and haters of the Academy Awards. The first of these is the snub, when an individual or movie fails to get a nomination for an Academy Award or fails to win it despite deserving it. Like how Denis Villeneuve wasn't nominated for Best Director for Dune Part 2, and how Roger Deakins failed to win for Best Cinematography 13 times. The second is the long overdue win. This is for individuals or movies who, after a long, arbitrary amount of time, finally win. The canonical example is Leonardo DiCaprio winning at last for The Revenant. Another is, again, Roger Deakins winning Best Cinematography for Blade Runner 2049, which he definitely deserved that year. Sometimes the winner can get the win for an overall weaker performance when compared to other nominations that they got and lost. Both of these traditions began with Bette Davis in back-to-back years. Perhaps the first major snub was for 1934's Of Human Bondage. This is the movie that helped turn lead actress Bette Davis into a star. In it, she plays a tea room waitress who's pined after by club-footed artists that she then takes advantage of. This was just the 7th Academy Awards, and 3 actresses had been nominated: Claudette Colbert for It Happened One Night, Grace Moore for One Night of Love, and Norma Shearer for The Bairds of Wimpole Street. When the nominations were announced, members of the Academy were outraged that Bette Davis wasn't on the ballot. As a response to the controversy, the Academy allowed a write-in campaign for anyone that they wanted. Claudette Colbert, who thought that this meant that Davis would win, was then shocked to learn that she had actually won and had to rush to collect her award. And then, as now, it's worth accepting that just because someone didn't get an award or nomination doesn't mean it was a conspiracy against that person. People just have different tastes. For some, that's a crime. For most, it shouldn't be. Still, a lot of people did feel that Davis was robbed of a victory, and apparently some in the Academy felt guilty enough over it that they awarded her Best Actress at the 8th Academy Awards for Dangerous. This time, Davis won the Consolation Oscar over what was considered to be the best performance of that year, Katharine Hepburn in Alice Adams. Not even Bette Davis thought that she deserved it. In her words, quote, "This nagged at me. It was true that even if the honor had been earned, it had been earned last year. There was no doubt that Hepburn's performance deserved the award. These mistakes compound each other like the original lie that breathes like a bunny. Now she should get it next year when someone else may deserve it," end quote. I guess the 7th and 8th Academy Awards set in motion a cycle that's continued unto now. Marlon Brando was no stranger to controversy and accolade. Widely considered to be one of the best, if not the best actor that Hollywood has seen, he became better known for his eccentricities starting in the 60s. He found himself falling out of love with acting, and this coincided with a period where his movies weren't as successful as they once were. He was also known to be difficult to work with, refusing to memorize lines. It got so bad that they had to be written on cue cards or fed to him through an earpiece. He claims that it was part of his method, but it could have just as easily been laziness. The man that brought him back to the fore was Francis Ford Coppola, who insisted on casting Brando in The Godfather over studio objections. I can kind of understand the studio's perspective here though. Brando seemed like a washed-up star who wasn't worth the pay that he wanted, and certainly not for the difficulties that he brought. Brando had to cede a little, agreeing to have half his salary withheld in order to secure the role that would make him a star once more. After the movie, his peers agreed that Brando's best years, rather than being behind him, might actually still be ahead. He was nominated for and won Best Actor for his role as Vito Corleone at the 45th Academy Awards. But for however curmudgeonly he was to his Hollywood peers, he was more than happy to use his very large, very loud microphone to give other voices a chance. Brando declined to accept his award in person and sent Native American activist Sacheen Littlefeather in his place to deliver a speech about the treatment of Native Americans in Hollywood. This was in the context of the Wounded Knee occupation in 1973, a 2-month-long protest and standoff when Oglala Lakota Native Americans and followers of the American Indian movement took over Wounded Knee, South Dakota, to protest the United States' numerous breaches of treaties with Native Americans over hundreds of years, as well as internal politics. Many people applauded her, and just as many, if not more, jeered and booed her. Hollywood icon and notable draft dodger John Wayne apparently had to be quote-unquote held back by security from forcing her off stage. Brando was disgusted with his peers, saying, quote, "They should have at least had the courtesy to listen to her," end quote. And after the fiasco, the Academy prohibited proxy acceptances. Decades later, the Academy would apologize for the treatment that she received. David Rubin, then the president of the Academy, wrote, quote, "The abuse you endured because of this statement was unwarranted and unjustified. The emotional burden you have lived through and the cost to your own career in our industry are irreparable. Far too long, the courage you showed has been unacknowledged. For this, we offer both our deepest apologies and our sincere admiration," end quote. Littlefeather passed away in 2022, while Brando passed away in 2004. He was curmudgeonly until the end. Elia Kazan was one of the most influential film directors in history, and movies like A Streetcar Named Desire and On the Waterfront, both of which starred and helped rocket Marlon Brando to fame, as well as 1955's epic East of Eden starring James Dean, are all considered to be some of the finest movies ever made. But as lauded as he is for his many contributions to film history, he was disdained by a chunk of the community for his complicity during the House Committee on American Activities, or HUAC hearings, campaign to blacklist members of Hollywood who were, or were thought to be, communists. He used to be a part of the Communist Party, USA, during the Great Depression. That would come back to bite him when American politicians decided to run roughshod over free speech, because no one actually cares about free speech unless they agree with it. In April of 1952, Kazan was called to the hearings. At first, he refused to name names, but eventually folded, selling out his friends. On his deciding to name names, Kazan said, quote, "There's a normal sadness about hurting people, but I'd rather hurt them a little than hurt myself a lot," end quote. The move would cost him many friends and result in a resentment that followed him until his death. When Kazan received an honorary Academy Award in 1999, half the crowd cheered, the other half didn't. And among those that did, some justified themselves after the fact. George Stevens Jr. said that he, along with many of his peers, were, quote, "standing for the same reason, out of regard for the creativity, the stamina, and the many fierce battles and lonely nights that had gone into the man's 20 motion pictures," end quote. Orson Welles, a man who only ever said what was on his mind, was much more blunt in his assessment of Kazan in 1982. Quote, "Elia Kazan is a traitor. He's a man who sold to McCarthy all his companions at a time when he could continue to work in New York at high salary, and having sold all his people to McCarthy, he then made a film called On the Waterfront, which was a celebration of the informer," end quote. Still, Welles would also separate the man from the director. He was a traitor, yes. He was a sellout, yes. But, like Welles said, quote, "I have to add that he's a very good director," end quote. Everybody wants to win the gold, but no one has had more of an unquenchable thirst for it than Harvey Weinstein. He turned campaigning for Oscars into an art form unto itself and is, in part, the reason that awards campaigns have become a cottage industry. I did a video on what I think is the most corrupt Oscar campaign in history, which I'll link in the description. But here, I want to talk about another campaign that Weinstein spearheaded that led to advertising reforms. It was for 2002's Gangs of New York, whereas Harvey Weinstein literally had people go to retirement communities full of Academy members to try and get them to vote for Shakespeare in Love a few years prior. This time he pulled out the big guns. He had former Academy President Robert Wise quote-unquote write an op-ed in the Los Angeles Daily News and the Long Beach Press-Telegram for Gangs of New York, which was nominated for 10 awards. Wise was a legend. He had won Best Picture and Best Director twice for West Side Story in 1961 and The Sound of Music in 1965, and was nominated for Best Editing for Citizen Kane. Then, Miramax ran an ad for the movie with the headline, quote, "Two-time Academy Award winner Robert Wise declares Scorsese deserves the Oscar for Gangs of New York," end quote. This was something of a Pickford situation where a powerful player in Hollywood seemed to be pressing the scales. This all blew up when it turned out that Wise had not written the op-ed. It was basically ghostwritten by Miramax publicist and had Wise's name on it. Everyone from Martin Scorsese to the rest of the Academy was pissed. Numerous ballots were recalled so that the Academy members could change their vote, and Academy President at the time, Frank Pearson, instituted a ban on, quote, "any form of advertising that includes quotes or comments by Academy members," end quote. Gangs of New York, a great movie that did not need any of this kind of help, would win no Academy Awards. 1940's Rebecca is worth talking about for a couple of reasons. One, it's the only Best Picture award that Alfred Hitchcock ever won, and while he was nominated for Best Director, that award would go to John Ford for The Grapes of Wrath. The other reason is that we see the lengths that David O. Selznick was willing to go to in order to secure his second Best Picture award in a row after 1939's Gone with the Wind. Rebecca was released in March of 1940, which meant that voting for the awards was many months away. Many of you might be familiar with the term Oscar bait. It refers to movies that are made for earning or winning Oscars. They also tend to be released later in the calendar year so that they remain fresh in voters' minds and still meet minimum eligibility requirements. David O. Selznick took offense to the march of time and the forgetfulness that it leads to, so he decided to spend some money to get Rebecca top of mind for everyone. So he threw a second premiere for the movie. This is something that we take for granted now. After Best Picture nominees are announced, many theaters run them again. It gives people a chance to catch up on movies that they might have missed or explore new ones. That started here with Selznick, who also read an official proclamation temporarily changing Hollywood Boulevard's name to Rebecca Lane. The thirst paid off. Rebecca would win Selznick the gold yet again. 1955's Marty might be the first movie in history whose Oscar campaign, which cost $400,000 at the time, was more expensive than the movie's budget, which clocked in at $343,000. Oscar campaigns are something of an industry now. Studios have teams and hire consultants whose job it is to bring in the gold. That's not new now, but it was new back then. To be sure, campaigning itself had been going on since the awards began. What Mary Pickford did definitely qualifies as a campaign, though I think it's a bit more dastardly than most. Pickford was also quite well known at the time. Marty, meanwhile, was more of a sleeping giant. It was produced by Harold Hecht for a studio that he'd co-founded and was up against the majors, 20th Century Fox, Warner Brothers, Columbia Pictures, and Paramount. What the studio lacked in size, it made up for with hustle and risk. They pulled out all the stops and would lay the groundwork for future controversies that would ensnare Miramax's approach to campaigns decades later. With Marty, Hecht decided to take a very personal approach. A lot of that money went to screening parties. Hecht would provide a print of the movie, a projectionist, and refreshments to those in attendance. It gave people a chance to mingle, and if there's one thing we know, it's that a lot of business gets done over food and drink. The tactics worked. It was nominated for 8 awards and won 4, including Best Motion Picture for Harold Hecht, Best Director for Delbert Mann, Best Actor for Ernest Bernine, and Best Screenplay for Paddy Chayefsky. Some things that were part and parcel of society decades ago are, for good reason, considered scandalous and controversial now. One obvious one is segregation. Hattie McDaniel made history in 1940 when she became the first black actress to be nominated for and win an Academy Award for playing Mammy in 1939's Gone with the Wind. For it, she beat out Olivia de Havilland, also for Gone with the Wind, Geraldine Fitzgerald for Wuthering Heights, Edna Mae Oliver for Drums Along the Mohawk, and Maria Ouspenskaya on Love Affair. When the movie premiered in Georgia, McDaniel was unable to attend thanks to the prevalent Jim Crow laws. It was the second time that Clark Gable, who played Rhett Butler, nearly blew a fuse over the film. Before that, he threatened to quit the movie mid-production if the studio's facilities weren't desegregated, which they were. The racism followed McDaniel all the way to her victory at the 12th Academy Awards. The ceremony was held at the Los Angeles Ambassador Hotel, which had a no blacks policy. McDaniel was allowed to sit in the audience as a favor, but was separated from the rest of the cast and her peers. The racism wasn't the only thing, though. McDaniel had to deal with accusations of perpetuating negative stereotypes for being cast in a domestic servant type role. Typecasting was prevalent for black actors at the time who didn't have many other roles written for them in popular movies. In McDaniel's words, quote, "I'd rather play a maid than be a maid," end quote. For her role and victory, McDaniel seemed to get it on all sides. She would never regain the same level of fame as she did with Gone with the Wind, though she certainly set quite the bar when the odds were most certainly not in her favor. I'm one of those people that enjoys the Academy Awards. I like seeing people come together to honor cinema as an art form. It certainly deserves it, having been at the center of a tumultuous century and having spurred many changes itself. However, when a campaign gets too political, it seems to suck the enjoyment out of the movie and the industry. That's different from a movie being political. There's nothing wrong with that, and artists should make the kind of movies that they want. But the movie should win on its own standing, not based on who had who for tea, or who threw the best party, or who had the best advertising campaign.